You're in the middle of a focused workout, sweat dripping, when suddenly a fantasy hits. Your mind drifts, muscles tense, concentration shatters. You try to shake it off with sheer willpower, but it pulls you back in, draining your drive. Days of retention feel at risk in seconds. Most guys battle this with force alone, but that's exhausting. There's a smarter way, simple mental moves that snap you back fast, keeping your streak strong without the fight. The fantasy appears during a work meeting. Within seconds, mental energy drains toward the image. Focus blurs. The retention streak feels threatened. This moment demands a specific response, not willpower alone. The first technique is cognitive interruption with redirection. When a sexual fantasy begins, the mind needs an immediate pattern break. Here's how it works. The moment a fantasy surfaces, a person identifies it without judgment, just recognition. Then comes the redirect. Instead of fighting the thought, he replaces it with a neutral image: a blue sky, a brick wall, the face of a clock. Here's what happens. This redirection activates attention control networks in the brain while shutting down automatic thought patterns. The key is replacement, not suppression. Suppression creates rebound effects. The thought returns stronger. Redirection gives the mind somewhere else to go. The result is a clean break from the fantasy loop within seconds. He sits at his desk. The fantasy starts. His hand moves to his chest, fingers pressing against his sternum. He names it silently, fantasy. Then the redirect, he pictures the coffee mug on his desk, its handle, the steam rising. 3 seconds. The fantasy loses momentum. His attention returns to the spreadsheet in front of him. His breathing steadies. The urge that felt overwhelming 30 seconds ago now registers as background noise. He clicks to the next cell and continues working. The second technique is mindfulness breathing anchor. When the mind spins into fantasy, the breath becomes the return point. A man focuses on the physical sensation of air entering his nostrils, filling his lungs, then leaving. Each breath counts. 1 in, 1 out. The thinking brain activates when focused on physical sensations, pulling energy away from mental imagery. This isn't about relaxation. It's about attention control. Time and again, we see that attention networks strengthen while default mental wandering decreases. The outcome is immediate. The fantasy fades because the brain can't fully focus on 2 things at once. Within 30 to 60 seconds of breath focus, intrusive images lose intensity. The third technique is sensory grounding. This pulls attention into the physical environment. A man identifies 5 things he can see, 4 he can hear, 3 he can touch, 2 he can smell, 1 he can taste. The process forces attention outward. The stress alarm calms when anchored to present moment sensory input rather than imagined scenarios. Each sensory detail activates different brain regions, fragmenting the fantasy's hold. The effect is rapid reorientation from internal imagery to external reality. The urge hits during an evening walk. His pulse quickens. The fantasy builds fast. He stops mid-stride, eyes open wider. He names 5 things: streetlight, parked car, tree branch, sidewalk crack, mailbox. 4 sounds: wind through leaves, distant traffic, his own breathing, a dog barking 2 blocks over. 3 touches: phone in his pocket, keys against his leg, cool air on his face. The fantasy collapses. His mind clears. He takes 3 deep breaths, feels his feet against pavement, and continues walking. The energy that almost derailed him now fuels the rest of his evening with clarity. Here's why these techniques work at the brain level. The thinking brain, the regions responsible for focus and decision-making, grows stronger with practice. Mindfulness and attention control create measurable changes in brain pathways within weeks. Neural connections supporting impulse control thicken. The brain learns to notice urges without automatically following them. This is neuroplasticity in action. The more a man redirects instead of indulges, the easier redirection becomes. Practical implementation. Practice these techniques 5 to 10 minutes daily, even when urges are low. This builds the mental muscle before high-pressure moments. Apps like Insight Timer or Headspace offer guided sessions for mindfulness training. Track progress in a journal, note when fantasies occur, which technique was used, and the result. Patterns emerge within days. One critical point: these aren't suppression tactics. Suppression, trying to force a thought away, backfires. Here's the thing: suppressed thoughts return stronger. Redirection is different. It acknowledges the thought, then shifts attention deliberately. The brain cooperates with redirection, but rebels against suppression. These techniques conserve mental energy during retention. Instead of burning resources in constant internal battles, attention stays directed toward productive activity. Testosterone remains stable without the spike crash pattern of fantasy-indulgent cycles. The result is sustained discipline that builds day by day. Those core techniques build quick mental shields against fantasies. Now, dive into the advanced strategies that strengthen your brain's control for long-term retention success. The thinking brain, specifically the regions handling decision-making, impulse control, and goal pursuit, controls executive function. When a sexual fantasy triggers, two systems compete: the thinking brain versus the reward system that craves immediate gratification. Here's what we see. Stronger thinking brain activation predicts better self-regulation. Every time a man redirects instead of indulges, the thinking brain grows stronger. The brain pathways supporting control thicken. The pathways driving automatic urges weaken. This is neuroplasticity, the brain physically rewiring based on repeated actions. The transformation happens within weeks. Initially, redirection requires conscious effort. The thinking brain fights against established urge patterns, but after consistent practice, something shifts. Redirection becomes automatic. A fantasy appears, and the mind moves to neutral imagery without strain. Focus remains stable. The mental battle shortens from minutes to seconds. This occurs because the brain's default patterns change. What once activated reward circuits now triggers attention control instead. An advanced technique builds on this foundation. Cognitive diffusion from acceptance and commitment therapy. Instead of fighting fantasies or redirecting immediately, a man observes the thought without attachment. He notices, there's a sexual thought, not I'm having a sexual thought, that creates identity fusion. The distinction matters. When thoughts exist as separate mental events rather than personal truths, they lose power. The brain recognizes them as temporary neural activity, not commands requiring action. Experience shows this observation without engagement approach reduces thought frequency and emotional intensity. The fantasy still appears, but it passes like a cloud across the sky, noticed, not followed. He sits in morning meditation, eyes closed, breath steady. The fantasy surfaces. His first instinct is redirection. He pauses. Instead, he watches. The image appears. He names it silently, fantasy thought, No judgment, no resistance, just observation. The thought lingers for 3 seconds, then begins fading. Another breath. The thought dissolves completely. His mind clears. 5 minutes pass. No further intrusions. He opens his eyes. The clarity he feels extends into his morning routine. Sharper focus on email. Cleaner execution on work tasks. The fantasy that would have derailed 30 minutes now lasted 3 seconds and left no residue. Combining techniques creates a comprehensive system. Start mornings with 5 minutes of mindfulness, breathing to strengthen attention control. When fantasies occur during the day, use cognitive interruption for immediate relief. In quieter moments, practice diffusion to reduce long-term frequency. Track patterns in a journal. What time do urges peak? What triggers them? How quickly do redirections work? Patterns emerge. A man notices fantasies spike during afternoon energy dips. He adjusts, takes a walk at 2 p.m. instead of scrolling his phone. The environmental change prevents the trigger entirely. The retention connection matters here. When mental energy stops draining into fantasy loops, that energy redirects toward productive action. Feel-good chemicals stabilize. Instead of spiking during fantasy and crashing afterward, levels remain steady. This creates sustained drive rather than boom-bust cycles. The hormonal system follows. Testosterone doesn't deplete through constant arousal release patterns. Energy accumulates. Men report heightened mental clarity, stronger decision-making, and increased physical vitality after several weeks of combined retention and mental discipline. One critical point. Mental control is a skill, not willpower. Willpower depletes like a battery. Skills strengthen with practice. A man struggling with constant fantasies isn't weak. He simply hasn't trained the attention systems yet. This distinction removes shame and focuses on process. Some cases require professional support. If intrusive thoughts stem from trauma or obsessive patterns, therapy with a licensed clinician provides targeted intervention. These techniques complement professional treatment, but don't replace it. Here's the science. Regular meditation practice reduces activity in the brain system, responsible for mind-wandering and intrusive thoughts. Less mind-wandering means fewer spontaneous fantasies. Simultaneously, thinking brain connectivity increases, strengthening control over impulses. Retention adds hormonal stability to this neural foundation. The combination, mental training plus retention, creates synergistic effects neither produces alone. Integrate these elements into a daily routine. Morning meditation builds baseline control. Midday awareness prevents trigger situations. Evening journaling reinforces progress. Self-assessments every 2 weeks track improvement. How many fantasies per day? How quickly do redirections work? What situations remain challenging? Adjust techniques based on data. If breathing works better than visualization, emphasize that. Customization increases effectiveness. The result is mastery, not perfection. Fantasies may still surface occasionally, but the response transforms from helpless reactivity to skillful management. The brain becomes a tool under conscious direction rather than a source of constant disruption. That shift, from controlled by urges to controlling attention, defines the retention journey's mental dimension. It separates temporary attempts from sustainable discipline. Core techniques like interruption and grounding give instant control over wandering thoughts. Advanced methods like diffusion rewire your mind for effortless discipline and steady energy. This week, next time a fantasy strikes during your routine, pause in a quiet spot. Take 3 slow breaths, feeling the air in your nose. Label it just a passing thought. Then name 3 things you see around you. This builds the habit to keep your focus sharp and retention strong all day. Share in comments your first win with these moves. Hit like if you're ready to master mental control. Subscribe for weekly tips on unbreakable retention habits. Unlock this skill, and your discipline turns into natural power.